There's this interesting exchange that takes place at the beginning of the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And I'll be honest, I did not go back and reread it, so this is me paraphrasing from distant memory. But Lucy's just discovered Narnia through the wardrobe, and she tries to convince her siblings that this happened, and they think she's playing a game with her because everybody knows that you cannot go through a piece of furniture to a foreign land. But it's finally brought to the attention of the professor with whom they're staying, and he asks the other siblings, he says, "Have you known your sister to be a liar?" They say, "Well, no." Do you think your sister would be lying about this is there some profit that she could gain from convincing you of this? No, not particularly. Is your sister given to hyperbole or exaggeration? Not that we've ever known. Does your sister hallucinate? No, not that I've ever experienced. Then, out of your long experience with your sister, perhaps it has to be taken into account, or it has to be considered a possibility that it's your understanding of furniture that's at fault here, and not your trust in your sister's integrity, in your sister's willingness to tell the truth. That it was their relationship with their little sister that the professor was arguing should count for something in attributing the truth to her testimony. On a natural level, we do this several times a day. That you and I engage in natural faith all the time. That we have to judge from the information that somebody's given us and the relationship we have with them and this thing and how much is at stake, whether or not what somebody's telling me is true. Does this person have a reason to lie? Are they a regular liar? Is this something that would benefit them if I believed it and it's a lie? The relationship that we have with a person matters and must be taken into account in how we determine what we do with information that they give us. One of the things that I found interesting as a priest, and I don't think this is sharing any particularly privileged information or any personally identifiable information because of how utterly universal of an experience it is, but it probably doesn't surprise anyone that as a priest hearing confessions, from time to time people will confess to me that they struggle with doubt in God, that they struggle and don't feel like they trust God enough. And what I found peculiar is so often, at least much more frequently than I would have expected, when people confess this, they confess it almost in hushed tones, like they're even more afraid that someone will hear this, like it is one of the most heinous of all sins that they could commit and have to admit to me. That they confess it like if somebody else in the parish heard it, they would get kicked out of the parish for their infidelity to God, for their lack of faith. And I hope for anybody who might be in that state, if I can allay some fears that you have, if you have ever experienced or are currently experiencing doubt or uncertainty in a particular teaching of the Catholic Church, or in God's love for you, or perhaps in God's existence, then welcome to the human race. There is not a single one of us present here who will make it all the way through life without experiencing that at some point. That doubt is part of the journey. In fact, the very way we talk about faith and fidelity seems to presume as much. That it's not when circumstances are good that we praise someone or marvel at someone for their faith in God. It's precisely when everything goes wrong and they remain faithful to him that we really are impressed by somebody's fidelity. that we marvel at the faith of someone who continues coming to Mass in spite of the circumstances of their life all seeming to go wrong. That faith is that fire in our heart that refuses to burn out even when everything conspires to quench the flame. And in that regard, then, I think it's helpful to look at faith and doubt the same way we would look at courage and fear. That the two of them are not opposites, at least not in any mutually exclusive way. That we don't speak of somebody being courageous when they have no fear. That if someone has no fear when a situation is objectively dangerous, they're in fact not courageous. They're foolhardy or let's just be honest, stupid probably. That you should have fear when your life is being threatened, when something is going dramatically wrong and something or someone that you love is being endangered. Fear is the appropriate response. A courageous person is not a person who utterly lacks that response. It's a person who knows when to persist through it and do the right or the good thing anyway. That's courage. Courage is not a lack of fear. It's a willingness to continue in spite of fear. And just then, as courage and fear are not mutually exclusive, neither are faith and doubt. That at points in our lives, doubt will arise, even through no fault of our own. It's what we do with that doubt that's either particularly praiseworthy and leads to people marveling at our faith, or is worthy of condemnation, or is in fact something that you do need to bring to the confessional. In our second reading, we hear about Abraham, our father in the faith. The promise God makes to him that from him and Isaac will be born a great nation. Abraham has reason to be suspect. First, because at least before Isaac is born, Sarah is barren, and it has not been known often that a woman who cannot have children has children. That tends to not be how that works. But even after Isaac is born, when God puts Abraham's faith to the test and asks him to offer up Isaac, that's going to make it really difficult for God to fulfill the promise of raising up a nation through Isaac. If Isaac is dead, he cannot have children. That's a fairly reasonable presupposition for us. Abraham had to have enough faith in the person of Almighty God. Persons, he didn't know that though. That judging from his past relationship with God, he was able to say, I do not know God to be particularly cruel in such a way as to make a promise that he did not intend to keep and crush my hope. I do not know God to be incapable of bringing about what he's promised. In fact, I believe he has the power to do it. And from what little I can gather and surmise, I think he cares about me and my family. That information can be valuable in helping to support the supernatural faith that might be present in his heart, but helpful in supporting his decision-making and believing, in spite of what he considers to be evidence to the contrary, that God is going to keep his promise. That Abraham had to make a decision to trust God or distrust God. And the natural evidence seemed to point against the trust, which means that there had to be faith to protect him against that occasion of doubt. That when we use the word faith, we can be speaking of a few different things, actually. And this isn't a theological dissertation. I'm not going to dig into that too deeply. But by faith, we can mean the kind of the natural assent that I talked about from the Chronicles of Narnia. By faith, we can mean the theological gift that God gave you when you were baptized, that there's nothing you or I can do to earn that There's nothing we did to make that happen, that's a gift God gave us to help us to believe in him. We can also be speaking about the action itself of belief. But when we look at that supernatural gift, when we look at the thing that God's given each of us to help us to stay trusting in him, when the circumstances of life seem to suggest something other than that seem to suggest that perhaps God is not worthy of our trust, that fire itself is something I didn't make happen. But what I am called to do and what I will be held responsible for is whether or not I'm feeding that fire and protecting it from the elements. Because to continue the analogy then, doubt is not much of the time us intentionally extinguishing the flame. It's not us pouring sand on the campfire. Doubt is a blustery day or a rain shower. Doubt is something that you and I did not necessarily cause. It's something over which we don't have direct control. And so the doubt itself is not necessarily a sin. There's not necessarily anything that you have to confess because the circumstances of your life have brought you to the decision point where you have to come to the determination of whether or not God is a Lord who keeps his promises. It's what you do when that doubt happens that matters. Do you protect the flame from the wind and the rain? Do you build a wall around it? Do you keep it stoked and burning hot? Do you at least keep your back to the wind so as to keep some of the elements off the campfire? Or do you stand back from it and watch the flame dissipate? Do you stand back and watch the fire in your heart go out? Because that's now when you and I have something that we have to bring to confession. If I am confronted with a question about my faith and I do nothing with it, now I am complicit. But if I take that doubt and I seek answers and I talk to people who have been at this longer than I have and still have their faith, if I try to read up on the faith or listen to good Catholic conversations or lectures, if it's about a particular issue in the church's teaching. Now, not only is that doubt not a sin, that doubt has actually led to something very praiseworthy. And God has brought great joy by that. Like you have taken an occasion for falling away from God and you have turned it into something that glorifies him. That you have allowed that flame to keep burning in spite of all of the attempts of the wind and the rain to put it out. That you've taken the relationship that you have with him and you've said, I know that some of the circumstances of my life right now seem to be pointing in a direction contrary to the fact that I believe God loves me. In spite of that, I trust in him and his purpose. I believe he is a God who keeps his promises, and I continue to persist in my belief. That's a powerful act of faith. That's the kind of example and occasion that causes people around us to look at us and go, that person has faith. It's not when everything's going right and it's easy. When our faith is never put into question, it's precisely when the questions arise that there's something there that's worth fighting for and emulating when we see it in other people. So what do we do if the doubt itself is not necessarily our fault? If circumstances can be beyond our control, how do we face that? I already talked about it briefly, but do what you need to do to protect the flame and to keep feeding the fire. That's part of why I think God, in his infinite wisdom, asks us all to get together like this at least once a week as a faith community in our parishes, because our faith is not something normally, in most circumstances, that's supposed to be lived in isolation. That we're supposed to be able to have people around us that we can turn to and say, look, I don't get how you make a fire, help me. I don't get how this works. What did you do when things went wrong? How did you fix this? How did you keep trusting? Why do you believe in spite of everything? Like, that's an honest and a beautiful question. And we ought to care about each other enough to be able to answer it, to be willing to give each other our testimonies of faith, to be able to say sometimes, if nothing else, what St. Peter said when so many of the disciples left, to whom else would I go? That he has the words of life. If what you're looking for in need is information, then find it. It's a beautiful thing about this generation that we have now that we didn't have when I was a little kid in the same way. I mean, not only do we have an abundance of books, and if you haven't ever noticed, there is a whole library back there in our choir room. Those books, as decorative as they are not merely decorative. You are allowed to read them, check them out, take them home with you. So please do that. They're not just meant to be ornamental. That is a parish library. There are a lot of really good Catholic podcasts on Spotify. There are also some bad ones, I guess. So be a little careful. But it's hard to go wrong with Father Mike Schmitz. It's hard to go wrong with the priest with whom we've been following this year with his prayers on the rosary. And most of his podcasts are like 15 minutes, which is great. Like, even I can pay attention that long. But find something to push back against that doubt. Even if you don't get your questions answered on the first go around, the very fact that you did it will itself help build up and protect your faith and will be greatly pleasing to God. Because the gift of our faith is a fire that you and I can't light ourselves, but it is a fire that God expects us to feed. And the doubts of our life are weather that, like the weather, we have very little control over. But just like the weather, they are things that we can prepare for to some extent, and they are things that we can provide for and protect against. That doubt is not something that you need to be ashamed of and speak of in hushed tones. In fact, sometimes that's a snare of Satan to keep you from getting the answers and the help that you need. But doubt is something that we can and must work against for our benefit and for the praise and glory of the God who has gifted us with the faith in the first place.